He had not lit a fire in that house in 2 years, but the smoke was there, rising from his own chimney, steady and unhurried like it had every right in the world to be there. And from 40 yards out, carried on the October wind, came something worse than the smoke. The smell of bread, the smell of a home. Someone was inside. Someone had swept his floors, washed his dishes, and put autumn leaves in the window where his wife used to grow things. And she was standing at his stove like she belonged there. He still had the rifle in his hand when she turned around and said, "Your dinner is almost ready." This is the story of what happened next and what got built from the ashes of what came before. There are moments in a man's life when the world stops making the kind of sense he has grown accustomed to. Not the dramatic kind of stop, not the kind that comes with thunder or the crack of a rifle. Just a quiet, absolute stillness in the chest, the way a clock feels when its mainspring finally gives out. Caleb Hargrove knew that feeling well. He had been living inside it for 2 years. He was riding home across the high meadow when he saw the smoke. October had come in hard that year, the way it always did in the Cascade Valley of Montana territory. The peaks to the north were already white, the first serious snowfall having draped itself over the granite shoulders of the mountains like a burial cloth. The aspens along the lower ridgeline had gone gold and were beginning to let go of their leaves, releasing them one by one into the cold current of air that moved perpetually down from the high country. Caleb had been up on the summer grazing land for 3 weeks, pushing the last of the herd down before the season turned savage. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Cutter, was tired and knew the smell of home and moved with the particular eagerness of an animal that had done its work and wanted its barn. Caleb was 40 yards from the gate when he saw it, a thin white column of smoke rising from the main house chimney, steady and unhurried, climbing into the pale blue October sky like it had every right in the world to be there. He stopped Cutter with the lightest pressure of his knees, and the horse obeyed instantly, standing still on the frost-stiff grass ears pricked forward. Caleb Hargrove had not lit a fire in the main house in 2 years. He sat in the saddle and looked at that smoke, the way a man looks at something that cannot exist and yet clearly does. His right hand moved to the stock of the rifle on his back before his mind had formed a single coherent thought. It was a rancher's reflex, the kind of response built over years of living in country where unexpected things were rarely good things. But even as his fingers found the familiar wood, something else moved through him, quieter than alarm and more unsettling. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. The smell reached him next, carried on the down valley wind. Bread, fresh bread, warm and yeasty, the kind that fills a house with a particular golden comfort. And beneath it, the deep, savory weight of beef stew, slow cooked with herbs, the kind of smell that belongs to a kitchen that is being used by someone who knows what they are doing. His main house had not produced a smell like that since Margaret. He made himself breathe. He made himself look at the whole picture before he moved. No strange horses at the hitching post. No wagon tracks in the yard that he could see from here. The front door was shut. The windows on the south side were dark, but there was a warm flicker of lamplight in the kitchen window, golden and steady, the kind of light that speaks of human presence as plainly as a voice. Caleb untied the rifle and held it across his saddle and rode toward the house at a walk. He had crossed Apache land alone. He had dragged half-drowned calves out of flood-swollen creeks at 2 a.m. without waiting for his brothers. He had stood at Margaret's grave in the driving October rain and held his face perfectly still for 1 full hour because he understood in some wordless part of himself that if he let go of the stillness, he might never find it again. Caleb Hargrove was not a man who frightened easily, but standing in his own yard, looking at smoke from a fire he had not built, something sharp and cold moved through his chest that he could not name. He tied Cutter to the porch rail instead of the paddock. He wanted the horse close. The front door was unlocked. He had not left it that way. He pushed it open slowly, rifle half raised, and stepped into the dim hallway. Warmth hit him first, and the smell hit him harder. The bread was closer now, clearly in the oven, and the stew was thick and fragrant on the stove. And there was something else sizzling in a pan with onions, and all of it together made the air of his house feel like something it had not felt in 2 years. Inhabited, not just occupied, but genuinely warmly lived in the way a house feels when the people inside it are actually present, not just sheltering from the elements. He stepped into the kitchen doorway and took in what was in front of him. The floor had been swept. 2 years of tracked-in mud and scattered straw and the slow accumulation of a household run by three men who cooked only to survive was gone. The tin plates that had lived in a precarious stack beside the dry sink were washed and stacked properly on the shelf. The heavy wool blanket he had left crumpled on the floor near the fireplace last spring was folded neat and square over the back of the chair by the window. The windowsill where Margaret had always kept a small clay pot with something growing in it held three branches of scarlet and gold autumn leaves in an old tin cup placed there, not accidentally but deliberately, with the particular care of someone who noticed such things. Someone had been in his house for more than an hour, and standing at his stove back to him, switch stirring the pot with the practiced ease of someone entirely at home in this kitchen, was a young woman he had never seen before in his life. She turned before he could speak. Caleb would think about that later. The fact that she had heard him come in despite his deliberate quiet, that she had registered his presence without spinning around in alarm, that she simply turned in the unhurried way of someone who had been expecting this moment and had already decided how she would meet it. She was young, somewhere in her early 20s, with honey-colored hair, pinned up in a practical travel style that had softened over the course of the day, loose strands framing a face that was delicate-boned and serious. She was slight in build, the kind of woman who looked smaller than she was, until you noticed the way she held herself straight and composed with the posture of someone who had been taught to carry themselves well and had kept that lesson even when everything else had been taken from them. Her eyes were the color of a clear October sky, cornflower blue, and they met his without flinching. Not fearless exactly. He had known fearless people, and it usually looked brittle. What he saw in her face was something different, something more considered. The look of a person who had already calculated the possible outcomes of this moment and made a measured peace with all of them. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said. Her voice was even, and there was a Philadelphia quality to it, the careful diction of education without the sharpness of pretension. "Your dinner is almost ready." Caleb stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and stared at her. "You're in my house," he said. "Yes." "You're cooking at my stove." "Yes." He looked around the kitchen again slowly, the way a man looks at a scene when he is trying to find the piece of it that explains everything else. His eyes stopped on the vase of autumn leaves on the windowsill. He looked back at her. "You cleaned at my house." "It needed it," she said simply, and turned back to stir the pot. For 5 full seconds, Caleb Hargrove stood there with his rifle in his hands and no clear idea what to do. He had expected silence when he rode home. He had expected the empty walls and the coal stove and the wee quiet evening with a glass of whiskey and whatever thoughts he could tolerate, the same as every other evening for 2 years. He had not built his life around those evenings, but he had arranged himself to endure them the way a man arranges himself to endure a wound that will not fully heal. He had not expected this. "How did you get in?" he asked. She didn't turn around. "Your back window doesn't latch properly. You should have that fixed. Anyone could walk in." She paused for a half beat. Anyone did. Something that might have been the very distant ancestor of a smile moved across her mouth, but it was brief and did not reach her eyes, and she did not linger on it. She lifted the pot off the heat and set it on the wooden trivet on the table, then laid a bowl and a spoon beside it with the quiet efficiency of someone setting a place that was meant to be sat at. "Sit down," she said. "Eat first, then I will explain." "You will explain now," Caleb said, "before I decide whether I'm riding into town for the sheriff." She turned fully then, and this time he saw what the dim kitchen and the first rush of his own alarm had caused him to miss. Her dress was navy blue and had once been good quality, but the hem was torn on the right side and stiff with dried mud all along the bottom. Her left boot had been stitched back together with rough twine, the careful repair of someone with no resources, but with enough practical intelligence to make do. And when she reached up to tuck a loose strand of hair back from her face, the sleeve of her dress shifted, and he saw the edge of a bruise along her left wrist. He looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he looked at her face. The bruise was old, 4 or 5 days at least already fading from deep purple to the yellowed edge of healing. It was not the bruise of someone who had been recently hurt. It was the bruise of someone who had been hurt somewhere behind them on a road that was getting longer by the day. Caleb lowered the rifle. He did not set it down, but he lowered it. "Explain," he said more quietly than before. She pulled out the chair across the table from where she had set his bowl and sat down in it with the particular dignity of a woman who has been taught that how you sit matters even when everything else has gone sideways. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. "I was traveling west with a wagon company out of Tucson," she began. "3 days ago, we crossed a wash that had flooded overnight. We lost 2 wagons and a man. I had no family on that train. I was traveling alone bound for New Mexico territory, where a woman I knew from my church had offered me work as a school teacher." She paused, not for effect, but to order what came next. "My mule broke its leg in the flood. I walked to Dry Creek." She stopped there briefly as if testing whether he intended to interrupt. He didn't. "The hotel in town charges 15 cents a night," she continued. "I don't have 15 cents. The man at the feed store told me there was a rancher east of town who lived alone and that the place looked as though it had been left to fall apart." She met his eyes evenly. "I thought perhaps I could offer an exchange, work for shelter, clean the house, cook the meals, repair what could be repaired. I walked out here and found no one home. The back window gave." She straightened slightly. "So I started a fire and began cooking. I thought you would either accept the offer or turn me out. Either way, you would have something warm when you arrived." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. She was not desperate in her manner. That was the thing he kept returning to, working it over in his mind like a stone that won't sit level. He had seen desperation, the hungry-eyed kind, the kind that made people careless and clumsy with the truth. This was not that. She was a woman who had run out of road and was looking at what remained with clear eyes and a level chin. There was a difference, and it mattered. "How old are you?" he said. 22. "You walked here from town." "It's 4 miles. I've walked further." "You cooked dinner for a man you've never met in his house without being invited." "I cooked dinner for myself," she said with a trace of something dry, "and made enough for 2 in case the owner came back before it was finished." He pulled out the chair and sat down across from her. "3 days," he said. "That is all." She nodded once. "You sleep in the storeroom, not the house." She nodded again. "I am not a charitable man, Miss Whitmore." "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm offering work." He picked up the spoon and tasted the stew. It was good. Not just adequate, not just nourishing, but genuinely, uncomplicatedly good. The kind of warmth that begins in your stomach and moves outward, the kind that fills up spaces that have been empty long enough to forget they were empty. He did not let that show on his face. "3 days," he said again. "3 days," she agreed. The back door opened with its familiar creak, and Seth Hargrove came in from the yard, boots leaving mud tracks across the newly swept floor. His hat pushed back at the comfortable angle he always wore it, the grin already forming on his face before he was fully inside. "Caleb, you're back." "Good, good. That means you already met," he said. And then he registered his brother's expression and the rifle still in Caleb's left hand, and something shifted in his own face from uncomplicated brightness to something more careful. "Ah." Caleb set the spoon down. He looked at his youngest brother with the particular expression of a man who has a great deal he intends to say and is deciding in what order to say it. Seth sat down. He explained quickly, which was to his credit, and directly, which was somewhat unusual for him. 6 weeks ago, while Caleb was on the high pasture and Wade was in Fort Benton buying corn, Seth had sat in his kitchen alone on a Tuesday evening and counted. He had counted the days since anyone in this house had laughed at something. He had counted the weeks since anyone had cooked anything that took more than 20 minutes. He had counted the months since there had been a voice in these rooms other than three men talking about cattle and weather and fence line. And then he had taken out paper and a pen and he had written an advertisement. He had placed it in the Philadelphia Eastern Gazette. The advertisement had been honest, Seth said with the emphasis of someone who knows the word is doing a lot of work in this sentence. It described the Hargrove Ranch in the Cascade Valley. It described the mountains and the land and the kind of life that required strength and willingness to learn. It described the three brothers, including the fact that the eldest had been widowed 2 years prior, and that the household needed, in Seth's careful phrasing, a woman of practical ability and good character. Ellie Whitmore had answered it. Caleb listened to all of this without speaking. He was aware of Ellie sitting across the table, not pretending she couldn't hear, not making any effort to soften the awkwardness of the situation. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes steady and waited. "You made this decision for me," Caleb said when Seth had finished. "If I had asked you, you would have said no." Then the answer was no. "Caleb." Seth's voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual ease. "She traveled 2,000 miles. The kitchen was silent for a moment, except for the low sound of the fire and the last few sputters of the pot still cooling on the trivet. "I have no family left to go back to," Ellie said, not defending herself, not pleading, just clarifying, placing the fact on the table the way you would place a tool you needed someone to see. Caleb looked at her. He looked at the bow of her folded hands and the straight line of her back and the bruise that had already begun to fade on her wrist. 3 days, he said, for what felt like the final time. "We will discuss what comes after when the 3 days are done." Eleanor Whitmore held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "That's fair," she said. The sound of a second horse in the yard broke the quiet of the moment, and then Wade came through the door, trail dusty, reading the room in the swift and practiced way of a man who had grown up in a household that required it. He looked at Seth. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the young woman sitting at the table where no woman had sat in 2 years. He looked at the swept floor and the washed dishes and the autumn leaves in the tin cup on the windowsill. "What is this?" he said. His voice was not angry. It was something more measured than angry, the tone of a man who has learned to keep his reactions on a short leash because he has seen what happens when you don't. "Sit down," Seth said. "We'll explain over dinner." Wade sat down. His eyes never fully left Ellie. The dinner was good and everyone knew it, and no one said so. The morning came in gray and cold, the kind of October morning in Montana that smells like iron and pine, and the promise of the first real snow still 2 or 3 weeks out. Caleb was awake before first light, the habit of 30 years of ranch work sitting in his bones like something structural. He lay in the dark for a moment, listening. From the kitchen, the sound of the fire poker against iron, the soft percussion of wood being fed into the stove, the quiet, deliberate movements of someone who had already been awake for some time. He lay still and listened to those sounds. In 2 years of mornings in this house, the first sounds of the day had been his own. The creak of his own weight on the floorboards, the scrape of his own chair. The silence of a household that began with one person and ended with one person, even when there were three of them in it. He was not accustomed to lying in the dark and hearing someone else already up, already moving, already making the ordinary preparations of a shared morning. His body did something then that surprised him. Something eased in his chest. Not much, not enough to name with any precision, but something. He got up. The coffee was already made when he came into the kitchen. Ellie stood at the south window with a cup in her hands, looking out at the yard in the gray pre-dawn light. She had her hair loose down her back, not yet pinned for the day, and she wore a plain wool shawl over her dress, and she was studying the yard the way a person studies something they intend to understand. "Morning," she said without turning around. "You're up early," he said. "On a working ranch you have to be." She turned then, and something in her expression had the quality of someone who has already done several things before the conversation started. "Your east fence line is down about 60 yards past the creek bend. The post wood is rotted at the base on 7 consecutive posts, not just one or two. Something has been getting into your chicken coop from a gap in the back wall, the north-facing side. Your water trough has a crack running lengthwise along the bottom that will split clean through when the water freezes in it. And your south barn roof is missing shingles in two places. The wood underneath has already started to darken. Caleb stared at her. You walked the property before sunrise. I couldn't sleep well in a new place. She set her cup down and took a torn piece of brown wrapping paper from her apron pocket. I made a list. She put it on the table. He picked it up. The writing was small and even and unhurried. The hand of someone educated in the way that was becoming less common as you moved west, every letter formed with care. The list was detailed. Not merely a record of problems, but an assessment each item noted with a practical understanding of both what was wrong and what the fixing of it required. East fence line, 7 posts, replaced before first hard freeze. Coop wall, single board repair north side. 2 feet of gap ground level. Water trough, seal and brace before temperatures drop below freezing or replace. South barn roof, 4 shingles missing 2 sections. Water damage to interior beam if not addressed soon. Garden plot, entirely overgrown. Not urgent but worth noting for spring. He read it twice. You made a list of everything wrong with my ranch, he said. I made a list of what can be fixed, she said. There is a difference. He looked at her across the kitchen in the early gray light, this young woman from Philadelphia who had walked 4 miles in torn boots and broken into his house through a window that needed fixing. And he thought about 2 things at the same time, which was more than he had been doing with his mornings for some while. I will show you where the fencing tools are, he said. She worked well. That was the thing about it, the thing he found himself returning to as the morning passed. She worked without performance, without the particular self-consciousness of someone trying to prove themselves, without the tentative quality of someone unused to physical labor. She drove fence posts with clean, efficient strokes, reading the angle of the wood and adjusting her swing accordingly, not wasting effort. She moved around the property with a kind of purposeful quiet that reminded him of the way Wade moved, actually the way of a person who had grown up doing necessary things and understood that the work itself was the point. Around mid-morning, while they were on the 3rd section of the east fence, he asked, "Where did you learn this kind of work?" She drove another nail before she answered. "My father had a small farm in Berks County, outside Philadelphia in the countryside. We lived there until I was 12 before he moved his practice into the city." He was a farmer. He was a lawyer, she said. Land law. The farm was his first life. The city was his second. She drove the last nail into the post, checked it with both hands, and reached for the next board. He kept the farm in his hands even after we moved. We went back on weekends sometimes when the season was right. He said it kept him honest. What happened to the farm? She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has a shape to it. It was part of what was taken, she said. He didn't ask more, and she didn't offer more, and they worked in silence for a while with the cold wind moving through the fence line and the mountains white against the gray sky above them. It was in the early afternoon when Caleb was in the barn checking Cutter's shoes and Ellie was repairing the gap in the coop wall that he heard the sound of hooves coming fast up the drive. Not the leisurely approach of a neighbor. The sound of urgency. Emmett Briggs pulled his horse up at the gate with the animal already blowing hard from a pushed ride. Emmett was a rancher from the next valley over, a solid man in his 50s who had never in Caleb's experience ridden fast for no reason. "Caleb," Emmett said, and his voice was tight, "you hear what happened to Jed Holloway?" Caleb came out of the barn. Behind him, he was peripherally aware of Ellie pausing in her work. "No," he said. "I've been up on the high pasture 3 weeks. What happened?" "Jed got served papers 2 days ago." Emmett dismounted, looked around the yard with the habitual caution of a man delivering information he wanted no one else to hear. "Debt claim on his land title. Says he owes back money from a transaction made 20 years ago. His father's name on the note. Jed's father has been dead since 65. "I know it." Emmett's jaw was set. "Papers look legal, though. official seals, notary, stamps the whole arrangement. Jed has 30 days to pay an amount yet none of us could pay in 30 years, or he surrenders the deed. He lowered his voice further. And there's a man in town, Caleb, came in 5, 6 days ago, name of Victor Crane, arrived from Tucson with 3 other men. He's been in the hotel bar buying drinks and asking questions about who owns what land, who has water rights, who might be carrying a debt or two. Something cold moved it through the air. Caleb said nothing, but his stillness changed its quality. Railroad money behind him, folks are saying. Emmett continued. Railroad wants the pass corridor. The man who owns the water between here and the pass owns the corridor, and everybody on both sides of it knows it. He glanced at the house at the window where the lamplight showed. Jed's just the first. That's what I came to say. Jed won't be the last. Emmett rode out 20 minutes later, and Caleb stood in the yard holding that information the way you hold something that has not yet made its full weight known. He was aware without turning around that Ellie had come up behind him and stopped at a distance of about 10 feet. He had not heard her approach over the sound of Emmett's departure, which he noted and which told him something. Then he heard her breathing change. Not dramatically, not the gasp of alarm, just a very small alteration in rhythm, the kind a person makes when a name they have not expected to hear in a certain place arrives in the air without warning and lands somewhere old and deep. He turned. Her face had changed. Not the expression of someone encountering a surprise, the expression of someone encountering something they had hoped against their better judgment to have left behind. The calm she had been carrying since the moment he walked through the kitchen door that evening, the composed and careful calm that he had been watching all day with the professional attention of a man who reads terrain for a living, had cracked just far enough to show what was underneath it. Something old, something not finished. You know that name, he said. It was not a question. She looked at him for a moment before she answered, and he could see her deciding something. Yes, she said. How Pete? She held his gaze. Victor Crane, it is the man who destroyed my father. That night, Caleb sat across from Ellie at the same table where she had set his dinner the evening before, and he listened. Seth had built up the fire without being asked, and Wade had come in from the cold and sat at the end of the table with his arms on the surface and his face closed and his eyes steady, and Ellie told all of it without pausing for sympathy and without the particular performance of a woman trying to win something. Edward Whitmore had spent 25 years building a reputation in Landsaw in Philadelphia. Not a wealthy man, but a respected one. The kind of lawyer who had clients who came back to him because he had been straight with them the first time. In the spring of 1871, a man had walked into his office requesting consultation on federal land filing procedures in the Western Territories. A standard inquiry, the kind of thing Whitmore had handled dozens of times. He had given the man 2 hours of his expertise and sent him on his way and thought nothing more of it. 6 months later, Victor Crane returned, this time with a leather satchel full of documents. A contract notarized and stamped claiming that Edward Whitmore had agreed to serve as legal representative for a land acquisition transaction, and in doing so had assumed personal liability for the balance of a debt attached to that transaction. The debt was large. The contract was detailed. The language was precise in the way that only someone who understood the law very well could make it precise, bearing the crucial liability clause inside paragraph after paragraph of standard boilerplate. The signature on the contract was her father's, she said, but it was not her father's signature. And the notary stamp on the document, she continued speaking slowly and clearly, as if she had rehearsed this part specifically belonged to a man named Asa Cornwell of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who had held that seal for 6 years before his death in 1868. 3 years before the contract was supposedly signed. She had spent 2 years after her father's collapse piecing this together, writing letters to clerks and lawyers and court secretaries in 3 states, looking for cases with similar patterns. She had found them. One in Arizona Territory in 1869, another in New Mexico in 1870, the same structure each time. a fraudulent document bearing the stamp of a dead man, the same number on each seal, and in each case the same name appearing at the acquiring party at the end of the process. Notary seal number 1147, she said, issued to a man who had been dead for years before any of these documents were supposedly authenticated. The same seal, the same number, in 4 different territories over a span of 8 years. The fire spoke in the silence. Your father, Caleb said. What happened to him? He appealed the ruling, she said. The court dismissed it. Her voice was even, and that evenness cost her something, but she paid it without showing the full price. He appealed twice more, both times dismissed. The office was confiscated to satisfy the debt in the summer of 1872. In April of last year, he suffered a stroke. She folded her hands on the table, the same precise gesture she had made the evening before when she had told him her name. He is alive. He is in a rented room in the outskirts of Philadelphia. He cannot speak clearly. He cannot work. I sold everything that remained after the seizure to pay his rent through the end of next year. And then you read Seth's advertisement, Caleb said. And then I read Seth's advertisement. He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at her with a directness that was one of the few things about himself he had never changed or softened. Crane is in Dry Creek, he said. 5 days. He knows about water rights. He knows the layout of the valley. He always knows the layout, she said. That is how he operates. He researches thoroughly before he moves. He identifies who holds the land with the greatest strategic value. Then he constructs the debt. By the time anyone understands what has happened, the paperwork already exists and the clock is already running. Wade, who had not spoken since they sat down, said a single thing. The water sources on this property, both of them. Ellie looked at him. Your land sits between the 2 reliable water sources in the entire northern half of this valley, she said. In a dry summer, whoever controls this ranch controls water access for 3/4 of the ranchers in this region. And if the railroad builds through Cascade Pass, which I believe they intend to do, the land sitting on both sides of that corridor will be worth more than any of us can imagine right now. The room was quiet. Seth looked at the table. Wade looked at Ellie. Caleb looked at the fire. He's not just here for Jed Holloway, Caleb said. No, she said. He's never just there for the first one. Jed is the proof of concept. He is establishing that the method works in this jurisdiction, testing the local response, measuring the resistance. The primary targets come after. And you come riding in from Tucson with a broken wagon and no money, Wade said. And his voice was not accusatory, but it was careful. The same week this man arrives in Dry Creek. Ellie turned her blue eyes to Wade without blinking. I know how that looks, she said. I would think the same thing in your position. Then tell me why I shouldn't. She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with a piece of string and placed them on the table between herself and Wade. These are 6 months of correspondence with a former federal land examiner named Franklin Aldridge in Prescott, Arizona. He is the only person who ever successfully challenged one of Crane's documents in court and failed by a margin of 1 vote on the evidentiary question. He has been building a case file for 5 years. I contacted him because I knew his name from a circuit court record I found in a legal archive in Philadelphia. Not because I ended up in this valley. I ended up in this valley because of Seth's advertisement in a flooded creek bed, and Victor Crane ended up in this valley because of the railroad. And those 2 things happening at the same time is either the worst coincidence in the history of Montana Territory, or it is the reason that finally, for the first time since my father fell, someone is in a position to stop him. She left the letters on the table. She did not push them toward Wade, did not insist he read them. She just left them there and let him decide. He looked at them for a long moment. He did not pick them up, but his eyes changed slightly in the way of a man revising a calculation. 3 days ran into 4, and 4 ran toward the end of the week, and no one mentioned the original 3 days again. There was too much work and too much to learn, and too much hanging in the air about Victor Crane and the Holloway deed, and what would come next for the household to have any energy left over for expiration dates. The work continued. The east fence was completed, the coop wall was repaired, and Seth built it better than it had been using extra boards Ellie had identified in the back of the south barn. Ellie spent an afternoon with a bucket of mortar sealing the trough crack, while Caleb and Wade worked the herd in the lower pasture, and when Caleb came back and saw it, he stood looking at it for a moment without saying anything, which was for Caleb Hargrove a form of acknowledgement. The evening settled into their own shape. Dinner at the long table in the kitchen, the four of them, Seth usually doing most of the talking, Wade usually doing most of the listening, Poleb somewhere between the two. Ellie cooked every night and no one asked her to, and she ate with them at the same table. And somewhere around the third evening, it stopped feeling like a strange arrangement and started feeling simply like the arrangement which Caleb noticed and filed away without comment. One evening near the end of the week, she was washing the dinner dishes, and Caleb was at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and the other two had gone to their rooms, and she said without turning around, "Tell me about this land." "Why?" he said. "Because the way a man talks about his land tells you whether he has given up on it or not." He looked at the table. After a moment, he said, "There's a creek that runs steady along the north border, except in the driest summers. Margaret, my wife, she planted 4 apple trees there about 6 years ago. They're still growing. You talk about it like it's still yours. It is mine. You talk about it like you're looking at it from a distance," she said, "like you have already let some piece of it go." That landed harder than he expected. He sat with it. "She has been gone 2 years," he said. "I know," she said, and her voice was careful and not unkind. "And this land is still here. And so are you." He did not answer, but he stayed at the table for a while after she had gone to the storeroom, listening to the sound of the fire and the wind on the windows, and the particular silence of a house that had, without anyone making a decision about it, begun again to feel like someone lived there. It was the third night of the second week when the trouble came. Caleb was not asleep. He had a habit of light sleeping during the transition to winter, the instinct for hazard that any man develops after enough years in high country. He heard the sound at midnight, or close to it. Not hoofbeats, not a voice, something lower, more immediate. The horses. He was on his feet and pulling on his boots before the second sound reached him. Not the casual shifting of animals settling for the night. The staccato, high-pitched cry of a horse in genuine distress. He went through the hall and out the side door and stopped in the yard. Orange light was flickering from the lower corner of the south barn. Not a large fire. Not yet. But fire in a barn is not a matter of size when it starts. It is a matter of seconds. Seth was already there, emerging from his room in the bunkhouse. Wade came from the other side of the yard at a run, a bucket already in his hand, having taken it from the water barrel at the bunkhouse door by pure habit. Caleb started for the barn at a dead run. He pulled open the barn door and the smoke hit him, not thick but present, and in the orange glow from the corner, he could see the source of fire working up the interior wall from near ground level. On the south side, dry hay, already catching the nearest stall panel, beginning to char at the base. The 3 horses were in their stalls in full panic, 2 of them already twisted against their lead ropes. And Ellie was in the barn. She was on the far side of the nearest stall, moving with a speed and deliberateness that stopped Caleb for a single beat of recognition. She had the second horse's lead rope off the ring, and the animal half-turned, talking to it low, one hand on the side of its face. The first horse, the gray mare, was already gone from its stall. Ellie had been here for at least a minute before any of the men had reached the barn. "Get out," Caleb said. "This one first," she said without looking at him. He crossed the floor, stepping over a spreading skirt of burning straw, reached the third stall, and got the big bay out in 6 seconds and moving for the door. He came back for Ellie and the second horse, and she had the horse through the stall door and moving, and he put his hand on her back and moved with her, and 15 seconds later, they were in the yard, in the cold, dark air with all 3 horses clear. Wade and Seth were working the fire with water and a saddle blanket. Wade's jaw set. Seth's face serious for once in a way that fit him like an unfamiliar coat. The fire was small enough that two men with buckets could manage it, and they managed it, and in 12 minutes the south barn was smoke-stained and smelling of char, but standing and no animal had been hurt. When it was done and the horses were tied and calming, and Seth was making a second check of the walls for remaining embers, Wade held up something he had found near the base of the burned section of wall, a piece of cloth, rough burlap, still damp with the smell of kerosene. He held it where Caleb and Ellie could both see it. "That was not an accident," Wade said. No one disagreed. Caleb stood in the yard in the cold night and looked at the blackened corner of his barn and felt something move through him that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but had elements of both and something harder underneath them. He had lived in this valley for 12 years. He had built this ranch from raw land and years of hard work and one good woman's faith in him, and he had kept it through drought and flood and every kind of hard winter the mountains had to offer. He looked at Ellie. She was standing a few feet away, her breathing steady now, a streak of soot across her left cheekbone where she had come close to something she probably shouldn't have come close to. The gray mare that had been the first horse out was standing beside her with its nose near her shoulder, and she had one hand on its neck without appearing to know she had put it there. She was looking at the burned wall of the barn. Her face was doing what her face had been doing since the moment Emmett Briggs said Victor Crane's name in the yard 2 days earlier. Not shock, not the expression of someone encountering something unexpected. The expression of someone watching a pattern they already knew resume itself with a terrible familiarity. She knew this, she had seen this before or something very like it, and she was recognizing it the way you recognize the opening bars of a piece of music you have not heard in a long time, but have never actually stopped hearing in some quiet part of yourself. Caleb said nothing. He looked at her for a moment in the cold dark, then looked up at the mountains that were invisible now against the darker sky. Then he went to help Seth with the last check of the barn walls. Inside the house much later, after the others had gone to sleep, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard where the horses were calm again in their paddock, and the cold stars had come out above the ridgeline. He had not asked for this. He had not asked for any of it. Not the advertisement Seth had placed without his knowledge. Not the young woman who had broken into his house through an unlatched window and swept his floor and set a tin cup of autumn leaves on a windowsill that had been empty for 2 years. He had not asked for Victor Crane to be in Dry Creek or for the Holloway family to be the first in what was clearly meant to be a series. He had not asked to find himself standing in his own kitchen in the middle of the night with a thought that was forming slowly and with a certain reluctant deliberateness in the back of his mind. The thought was this: she had come here carrying information that had taken her 2 years to build. A dead notary seal, a pattern of fraud across 5 territories. The name of a man in Prescott, Arizona, who had been trying to build a case for 5 years without the piece that would make it hold. And Victor Crane had sent someone to this ranch tonight. Not because Ellie Whitmore was a threat on her own, but because she was a threat in combination because something had changed in the valley in the last week that Crane had noticed or suspected, because the presence of a woman who knew his methods in the same territory where he was operating was something he could not afford to ignore. Caleb put his hand flat against the cool glass of the window. He thought about the list on the brown paper. He thought about the fence posts replaced before the hard freeze. He thought about the way she had said quietly and without ceremony that the land had not died, it had only been left. He thought about the sound of someone else up before dawn, moving carefully through his kitchen, already beginning the work of the day before anyone had asked her to. 3 days, he had said. He looked out at his land in the dark and the mountains beyond it, and the smoke that still lingered faintly in the cold air from the burned corner of his south barn. Tomorrow he thought we'd figure out what to do about Crane. The morning after this fire, the south barn smelled of char and cold ash, and the sky above the Cascade Peaks had the particular flat gray of a season preparing to turn serious. Wade found the second piece of kerosene-soaked cloth at first light tucked under the gap between the foundation log and the earth wall, placed there deliberately, not thrown. Whoever had done this had not been in a hurry. They had not been afraid of being heard. They had known the layout of the property well enough to move through the dark yard without disturbing the horses until the fire was already set. That fact sat at the breakfast table with the four of them and did not require any of them to speak it aloud. Seth ate with less talking than usual, which was its own kind of weather report. Wade drank his coffee and looked at the window. Ellie had the fire going and breakfast on the table before any of them had spoken a word about the morning, and she sat with them and ate, and Caleb watched all of this from his end of the table and said nothing because nothing he might say had yet formed itself clearly enough to be worth saying. After breakfast, without any particular announcement, he went upstairs. He had not been to the upper level of the main house in close to a year. The stairs creaked in the same places they always had, the third and the seventh step, the particular pitch of each creak as familiar as his own voice. The hallway at the top held the same quality of cold, undisturbed air that closed rooms accumulate over time. Not the cold of neglect exactly, but the cold of waiting of preserved stillness. The door at the end of the hall was shut. He did not stop at it. He went to the storage room at the far end, where the roof pitched low and the daylight came in thin through a single small window, and he moved the crates that needed moving and the rolled canvas that had been waiting 2 summers to be rehung as a barn divider, and he found the tool chest at the back where he had left it in the spring. He pulled it toward the light. It caught on something. He looked down and saw the corner of a wooden box half wedged under the chest pushed back against the wall. He had not put it there. He stared at it for a moment, then crouched down and pulled it out. It was a small crate, the kind used for shipping glass jars, the interior divided into sections with thin strips of wood. Inside it, packed with the deliberate care of someone ensuring it would not shift, were several items. A spool of thread, a paper packet of dried lavender, a small folded piece of cloth that he recognized as a repair to a curtain that had never been made. And in the corner section, wrapped in a square of oilcloth tied with twine, a small notebook. He knew the oilcloth. He had bought it at the general store in Fort Benton in the summer of 1869, and Margaret had used it to wrap things she wanted to keep dry. He sat back on his heels in the low-roofed storeroom and looked at the wrapped notebook for longer than was probably reasonable. Then he unwrapped it. The cover was blue cloth, worn soft at the corners. Inside her handwriting, the particular slope of it that he had not seen in 2 years, the way her capital letters always leaned slightly forward as if they were trying to get somewhere. He sat down on the floor of the storeroom and he read. Margaret Hargrove had not kept a diary in the usual sense. The notebook was not a record of days and feelings, but a working document, the kind a practical person keeps when they are tracking something they do not yet fully understand. The entries were dated but brief observations rather than reflections. The first relevant entry was from the previous summer, 14 months before she died. She had written about a man she had seen walking the property line on the north side of the ranch, the side that ran along the upper creek. He had come 3 times in 2 weeks, always on foot and always alone and always staying on the far side of the fence line, so that there was nothing technically objectionable about his presence. She noted that he spent particular time near the creek's source, the upstream point, where the water emerged from between 2 granite formations above the tree line, and near the place where the property line met the old trail that ran toward Cascade Pass. She had asked about him in town. Nobody knew who he was. A month later, another entry. She had been in Dry Creek when the telegraph office received a message addressed to a man staying at the hotel. She had not seen the contents, but she had heard the name spoken between the telegraph clerk and the hotel keeper when the message was delivered. The name was Victor Crane. She had asked who he was. The hotel keeper had said he was a land investor from the south, just passing through, had already left by then. 3 months before she died, a longer entry. She had written to a friend in Fort Benton, a woman whose husband worked for the Territorial Land Office, asking if anyone there knew the name Victor Crane. The friend had written back. Her husband had heard the name in connection with a disputed land claim in New Mexico territory from the year before. He could not say more than that. But the friend had added at the end of her letter that her husband had said to be careful, that the name had come up in a way that suggested the man behind it was not the kind of man who appeared in land disputes by accident. Margaret had underlined those last 6 words, and then the final entry written 7 days before she fell ill. The handwriting was the same, steady and clear, not the writing of a sick woman, not yet. The North Creek water has had an unusual quality the last 3 days, a taste I do not recognize. I will ask Doc Whitfield when I am in town Thursday. I have not said anything to Caleb yet because he is deep in the autumn push, and I do not want to worry him with something that may be nothing. Caleb sat in the low-roof storeroom of his own house with that notebook in his hands and did not move for a long time. Below him, he could hear the ordinary sounds of the house continuing. Seth's voice, the scrape of a chair, the particular sound of Ellie moving from one task to another with her characteristic efficiency. The world below the floorboards was proceeding in its ordinary way, and he was up here with a piece of paper in his hands that had changed the shape of the last 2 years into something he did not yet have words for. He had believed in the quiet certainty that sits below the level of examined thought that Margaret had died of a sudden fever, the kind that took people in the mountains without warning or reason, the kind that was simply the randomness of life in country where medicine was far away and the body was not always strong enough. He had carried that belief like a stone in his pocket, heavy and constant, the weight of something that could not be changed or questioned, only endured. He had built his 2 years of solitude on the foundation of that belief. He sat in the storeroom and felt the foundation shift. He came downstairs carrying the notebook and nothing else, and he walked through the kitchen where Seth and Wade were talking about the fencing schedule, and he set the notebook on the table in front of Ellie, who was sitting with her own papers at the far end. She looked up at Annie, Mom. She looked at the notebook. She read it without speaking, turning the pages with care, and he watched her face while she read, and he watched the moment when she reached the final entry, the very slight stilling of her expression that told him she understood what she was looking at. She finished reading and closed the notebook and placed her hands over it on the table. I am sorry, she said quietly. Don't, he said, not yet. Tell me what this means. She looked at him steadily. It means he was here before your wife died. It means he had already identified this property as a target. And it means that the water source on your northern boundary was compromised in a way that your wife noticed and intended to investigate. She paused. I cannot tell you with certainty what caused her illness. There is not enough here to prove anything, and too much time has passed to establish it now. But I can tell you that this is consistent with how he operates when he encounters resistance he does not expect. You're saying he would have done that? I'm saying it is within the range of what I know him to be capable of, she said, and her voice was precise and level and did not offer him false comfort, which was the only kind he could have accepted. He is not a man who uses direct violence when indirect means are available and less traceable. Seth had gone very still at the other end of the table. Wade stood in the doorway of the kitchen with an expression Caleb had not seen on his brother's face since the night Margaret died. Caleb sat down across from Ellie. He put his hands flat on the table on either side of the notebook, the way a man grounds himself when the ground beneath him is uncertain. I am changing the arrangement, he said. She waited. You are not leaving in 3 days. You are not leaving until this is finished. His voice was measured and quiet, the voice of someone making a decision that has already been made, not deliberating. In exchange, you tell me everything you know, every piece of what you have gathered, every letter, everything Aldridge had told you, everything. She held his gaze for a long moment. All right, she said. The next 3 days had the quality of a campaign being planned. Ellie spread her papers across the kitchen table and explained the structure of what she had spent 2 years assembling, and Caleb and his brothers listened with the focused attention of men who understood that what they were hearing was not abstract. Seal number 1147, the dead notary in Lancaster County, the cases in New Mexico and Arizona, and 2 others she had traced to parcels in Colorado Territory, all of them involving water rights, all of them following the same arc of fabricated debt an impossible deadline in legal language designed to overwhelm rather than inform. Franklin Aldridge, formerly of the Federal Land Examination Office, now retired to Prescott, Arizona, had been the first person in any official capacity to examine one of Crane's documents with genuine suspicion. He had brought the question to a territorial court and come within one judicial vote of having the document declared fraudulent before the case was dismissed on a procedural technicality. He had resigned from the land office the following year. He had continued on his own time and at his own expense to build a file. Ellie had been corresponding with him for 6 months. He needs one thing, she said. He needs a primary document, an original bearing the seal connected to a living case that has not yet been adjudicated. Everything he has built is from closed cases. This is the first time there is an active claim, a current filing a deed dispute still in process that carries the same seal in the same sequence. Jed Holloway's papers, Wade said. If Jed would allow his documents to be taken to Prescott and placed in front of Aldridge before the 30-day deadline runs out, and if Aldridge can certify the seal match to his existing file, we have something a federal court can act on. She looked around the table. Not a territorial court, federal. Because the fraud crosses territorial lines, the case belongs in federal jurisdiction, which means the local arrangements that may exist between Crane and the territorial bench do not apply. Wade straightened at that last sentence. You're saying he has a judge. I'm saying it would be consistent with his pattern to have ensured sympathetic handling at the territorial level, she said. I don't have proof of that specific to Montana, but in 2 of the 5 cases I traced, the territorial court ruling came faster than the evidence warranted, which suggests that the outcome was not entirely a function of the evidence. Then we cannot take this to the courthouse in Dry Creek, Caleb said. Not as the primary venue, no. Prescott is 6 days' ride. Vavete, Wade said, and everyone looked at him. If you take the South Pass route and don't stop for comfort, I've done it. Something shifted in the room, a quiet but perceptible change the way air changes when a decision has been made before it has been spoken. I'll go, Wade said, with you and the woman. Seth stays with the property and watches the Holloway situation. Caleb looked at his brother. 2 weeks ago, Wade had sat at this table and asked Ellie questions designed to find the flaw in her story. He was looking at her now with an expression that was not warm, not exactly, but it had settled into something different from suspicion, something more like the grudging and still cautious acknowledgement of a man who has run the calculations twice and come out the same place both times. You're willing to make that ride, Caleb said. I know the terrain, Wade said, and I know what's at stake better than anyone is saying out loud. He meant Margaret. They all knew that he meant Margaret. Wade had loved his sister-in-law with the reserved and absolute devotion of a man who does not use the word love freely, and he had carried her loss in his own way for 2 years, which was quietly and entirely the way he carried everything. The morning before they were supposed to leave, Ellie was in the small storeroom that served as her sleeping space, organizing her papers for the journey, when she heard a sound from the other side of the door that gave her pause. Not a voice, just the particular creak of floorboards outside the room, the sound of someone standing still. She opened the door. Wade was there, not moving away, not pretending he had been passing through. He held something in his hand, a folded piece of paper, and he set it on the work table between them, with the flat precision of a man presenting evidence rather than making an accusation. That was Wade's way, the question doing the work that a raised voice would have done for anyone else. She recognized the paper immediately. It was one of the drafts she had been working on, a letter intended for Edward Carver in Washington, a man who had worked with her father and now held a position with the Federal Land Commission. The draft contained specific information about the Hargrove Ranch, its location relative to water sources, the acreage and layout, and the nature of the current threat. She had not hidden it, but she had not announced it either. You were sending information about this property to someone in Washington, Wade said. Yes, she said. Sit down and I will explain it properly. They sat at the work table, the two of them, and she told him about Edward Carver. the history of the man, his connection to her father, his current position, and the precise reason she had been drafting the letter. She explained that Carver had the authority, if presented with a sufficiently developed case, to request that the Federal Land Commission place a hold on any territorial land transfer in a disputed corridor pending investigation. That hold would function as a ceiling over Crane's operation, regardless of what any territorial judge decided. It would buy time. And time in a case like this, where the evidence was solid, but the delivery mechanism was slow, was the only resource they could not manufacture. "You were going to send this without telling Caleb," Wade said. "I was going to tell him tonight," she said. "I wanted to have the draft finished first, so I could show him the actual text rather than describe it. I have learned that showing a man the specific words is more useful than describing the general idea. You have been careful about what you share and when." "I have been careful about everything since my father fell," she said. "Every piece of information I have shared with the wrong person in the last 2 years has cost someone something. I am not secretive out of deception. I am secretive out of a pattern of hard results." Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked at the draft letter, not reading it again, just looking at the paper. "My brother trusts you," he said finally. "He is extending the benefit of the doubt," she said. "That is not the same thing, and I am not going to pretend it is." "No," he said. "It is past that now." He said it without sentiment, as a factual correction, and handed the letter back to her. "Finish the draft. Show him tonight." He stood up. At the door, he stopped, which was the most Wade Hargrove equivalent of having something important to say. "The night Margaret died," he said, "I was in the barn. I heard Caleb call for me, and I got there too late to do anything." He did not look at her while he said this. He looked at the doorframe. "I have been angry at a great number of things since then. Most of them could not be angry back at me." He paused. "I do not entirely know what to do with a person who gives that anger somewhere reasonable to land." He went out, and she sat with that for a while. She showed Caleb the draft that evening, as she had said she would, and she explained Carver and the logic of the federal hold mechanism, and he read the draft once through and set it down. "You were going to tell me tonight," he said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he said, "Send it." They left before first light the next morning. 3 riders, Caleb in front and Ellie between him and Wade, the horses moving through the frost-stiff meadow grass with breath rising in white clouds in the darkness. Seth stood at the gate as they passed and lifted a hand, and Caleb nodded once, and they rode. The South Pass route was not the more traveled road. It was Wade's country, the route he had used in his years of solitary riding before the ranch had needed him to stay closer, and he moved through it with the particular ease of a man navigating from memory. The terrain was harder and less forgiving than the main trail, but it was faster by half a day, and it offered fewer places where 3 riders moving with purpose could be conveniently observed and followed. The first day was long and cold and mostly silent. Ellie rode well, better than Caleb had anticipated, sitting the horse with a balanced competence that spoke of genuine experience rather than occasional familiarity. She did not complain about the pace. She did not ask for rest stops beyond what the horses needed. She watched the terrain with the same attending quality she had brought to her first morning survey of the ranch, absorbing information about the country they were passing through, as though she might need to navigate it later without assistance. At the evening camp on the first night, while Wade was tending the horses and Caleb was building the fire, she helped with the cooking supplies and then sat down near the fire and pulled her journal from her saddlebag and continued her notes. He watched her from across the fire without making a study of it. The journal was the same kind of practical record that her collection of letters represented, not personal in the diary sense, but operational, a working document for a person who had learned to treat information the way you treat a tool that might save your life if you keep it sharp. He thought not for the first time about the fact that she had been doing this alone for 2 years. Not with a brother riding alongside her in a household to come back to each evening, but entirely on her own in a city where she had watched her father be methodically destroyed and had responded not by collapsing, but by beginning quietly and systematically to build something that might one day constitute an answer. He fed more wood to the fire. On the second day in the early afternoon, they crossed a narrow wooden bridge over a deep-cut creek bed where the walls dropped 20 feet to dark water below. The boards were old solid enough but filmed with frost. Caleb crossed first, feeling the boards flex slightly under the horse's weight, satisfactory but not comfortable. Ellie started across behind him. The gray mare picked her left forefoot up wrong on the second board and skidded the shoe, finding nothing to grip on the frost-slicked wood, and the horse lurched left toward the railing, which was a single split rail that had not been intended to stop much. Caleb turned at the sound and was moving before the picture fully registered, and he reached her as the mare was finding her balance again. One hand going to the horse's neck and his other hand closing around Ellie's forearm, steadying the whole apparatus of horse and rider in the particular practiced way of a man who has pulled animals back from the edge of things his whole adult life. The mare steadied. The bridge held. Ellie looked down at his hand on her forearm. He was aware that he had not released it, and he was aware that this had been noticed, and he was aware that 10 seconds had passed since the moment of danger and the reason for the grip had technically resolved. He released it. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was even, but something in her breathing had changed in a way that was not fear. He filed that away without examining it. Wade came across behind them and glanced at the railing and said nothing, which was Wade's way of having noted everything. They rode on. They reached Prescott on the afternoon of the third day, coming down out of the higher country into the high desert plateau where the air tasted of juniper, and the light had a clarity that was different from Montana's harder-edged, without the softness that altitude and moisture gave to mountain light. Franklin Aldridge lived in a two-room house on the eastern edge of town, the kind of house that has been inhabited by one person for a very long time and has taken on the shape of their particular habits, stacks of paper organized in ways that only made sense to their curator, shelves of files that had their own internal geography. He was a thin man in his early 60s with the unhurried manner of someone who has been patient for a long time and has made a kind of peace with patience. He opened the door before they knocked, which meant he had been watching the road, which meant he had been expecting them, which meant Ellie's letters had prepared this meeting more thoroughly than she had mentioned. He shook Ellie's hand first. He said, "Miss Whitmore, I hoped it would be sooner, but I am glad it is now." Then he looked at Caleb and Wade with the assessment of a man who has spent decades reading the difference between a landholder with something to protect and a man with something to hide. "Come in," he said. "We have a great deal to do and a limited amount of time to do it." What followed was 3 hours of the most concentrated work Caleb had done in a long time. Not the physical work of the ranch, but the harder work of precision, of following a legal argument through its turns and testing its weight at each point. Aldridge laid his file on the table, 5 years of patient accumulation, and he and Ellie matched its contents against the Holloway documents that Ellie had obtained copies of from Jed through Seth before they left. The seal match was unambiguous. Aldridge placed the two documents side by side under his reading glass and called Wade over to look, and Wade looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Same die," Aldridge said. "Same wear pattern on the outer ring, same slight elongation on the second numeral. This is not a reproduction or a similar seal. This is the same physical implement used to stamp both documents 20 years and 400 miles apart." He straightened up. "In court with a proper expert examination, this is not deniable." "What does it get us?" Caleb said. "It gets us proof of a pattern," Aldridge said. "Proof that the same instrument has been used repeatedly across multiple jurisdictions to authenticate fraudulent documents. Proof that this is not an isolated forgery, but a systematic operation." He looked at Caleb directly. "It gets us a federal fraud case if we can get this to the right court." "There's a problem," Wade said. The room looked at him. "You said the right court, not the territorial court." Aldridge nodded once. "There is a circuit judge in this territory who has ruled in Crane's favor twice in cases where the evidence was sufficient to have gone the other way, Aldridge said. I cannot prove the connection, but I know it exists the way you know the weather is changing before the first cloud appears. The case cannot go through the territorial bench. Federal jurisdiction, Ellie said. The fraud crosses territorial lines. That is sufficient to invoke federal court authority. Edward Carver, Caleb said. She looked at him. The letter you sent, has he responded? Not yet. It was too recent. But if Aldridge can send his certification directly to the Federal Land Commission through his former contacts in Washington, simultaneously with our filing in the territorial court, we create two parallel processes. The territorial court cannot simply dismiss a case that is already part of a federal commission inquiry without answering to a higher authority. Aldridge was already looking at her with the expression of a man who has been working on a problem alone for too long and has just been handed the piece he was missing. I can send the certification tonight, he said. I have the contacts remaining. It will reach Washington within the week. We need it there before the Holloway deadline, she said. Then I will write it this evening. They ate a brief meal at Aldridge's table and discussed the specifics of what he would write and to whom, and Caleb contributed what was needed and listened carefully to what he needed to hear. And by the time the sun had gone below the plateau horizon, the outline of the plan was set. On the way out, Aldridge touched Ellie's arm briefly and said quietly enough that he perhaps did not intend everyone to hear, "Your father would be proud of what you have done with this." She did not answer him. She nodded once and went out to the horses. Caleb watched her walk across the yard in the last of the desert light, the way she carried herself straight and unhurried, never letting the weight show in her posture even when it was clearly there. And he thought about a man sitting in a rented room in Philadelphia who did not know that his daughter was in Arizona territory, having ridden 3 days on a mountain route to close the circle of something they had all been standing inside without knowing the shape of it. He thought about the North Creek at home and the 4 apple trees planted in a line along its bank and the woman who had planted them. They left Prescott at first light. The return journey had a different quality. The information had been gathered, the pieces were in motion, and the road home carried with it the particular tension of people who have done what they could and must now wait to see whether it was enough. Caleb rode without speaking much, and Wade rode without speaking at all, which was not unusual, and Ellie rode between them and watched the country passing and also said very little. On the afternoon of the second day of their return, Wade pulled up his horse and looked back along the trail. "We have company," he said. Not behind them at that moment, but the sign was there the way the desert to the southeast held a dust signature that was wrong for winter animals. A rider, or possibly two at a sustained distance, that was too consistent to be coincidental. "How long?" Caleb said. "Since the canyon fork this morning," Wade said. "Maybe longer." Ellie looked back along the trail without turning her horse, the subtle glance of someone who has thought about this contingency before. "He would have known Aldridge was the most likely contact," she said. "If he was watching Aldridge's house, he knows we were there. He knows what we were doing." "Can he stop it?" Caleb said. "The certification Aldridge sends is already beyond his reach," she said. "The letter to Washington is sent. What he could do is prevent the documents we are carrying from reaching the filing in Dry Creek. Without the physical evidence at the territorial hearing, even with Aldridge's federal certification, the local case is weaker." "He can't have what we're carrying," Wade said. "No," Caleb agreed. "He cannot." They split at the next significant canyon junction, the kind of landmark that offered a choice of routes to anyone following. Wade took the high route, the one that required knowledge of the terrain to navigate in fading light. The trail went cold behind them around dusk, and they did not see the dust signature again. They were one day out from Dry Creek, camped in the upper meadow below the Cascade Ridgeline, when the exhaustion and the altitude and 3 days of hard riding finally asserted themselves. The fire was low and the horses were quiet, and the stars over the Montana peaks had the cold, hard brilliance of October at altitude. Wade was asleep. Ellie sat near the fire with her knees drawn up, looking at the ridge above them, the line where the dark rock met the darker sky. You have been running this case inside your head for 2 years, Caleb said. Yes. Alone. There was no one else who knew enough to help and had reason to trust. She did not say it with self-pity. It was a description of conditions the way you describe weather. After this is over, he said. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at the fire for a moment before he continued with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to say something and is choosing each word with care. After this is over, he said, I would like for the 3 days to be a thing we no longer discuss as a formal expiration. She was quiet. I am not good at saying things directly when the things are not practical in nature, he said. That is a limitation I am aware of. You are doing reasonably well, she said. Something passed between them in the firelight. Not words and not touch, but something more durable than either the particular acknowledgement of two people who have been paying close attention to each other for weeks and have arrived independently and without ceremony at the same recognition. We should sleep, he said. Long day tomorrow. Yes, she said. They came down off the ridge into Dry Creek late in the afternoon, and Seth was waiting at the junction of the main road with his hat pushed back and his horse blowing from a hard ride in, and his face had the quality of a man who has been holding several pieces of news and is deciding which order to deliver them in. Crane pushed the hearing, Seth said. To when, Caleb said. Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Wade said something under his breath that was not for polite company. There is a letter for Ellie, Seth said. No name on the outside, left at the feed store this afternoon. He handed it across. Ellie broke the seal and read it. Her face did what her face had done twice before when Crane's shadow fell across a moment, that particular stilling, that involuntary recognition. She handed it to Caleb. It was brief and very clear. It acknowledged that she was at the Hargrove Ranch. It acknowledged that she had been in Prescott. It said that her presence in Montana Territory was noted, and that if she chose to leave the territory before the morning hearing, the matter of the Hargrove Ranch's water rights would not be pursued further through the current legal avenue. It gave her until midnight to act on this information. Caleb read it once. He looked at the paper for a moment at the careful handwriting of a man who was very confident in the architecture of his own leverage. Then he walked to the ranch house, carried the letter into the kitchen, and placed it in the open stove. The paper caught and blackened and was gone in under 10 seconds. He turned around. The three others were in the kitchen doorway. Seth, he said, go get Jed Holloway, Silas Pruitt, Minnie Calhoun, and Harlan Dodd. Emmett Briggs, too, if he can come. Tell them to be here by 8 o'clock tonight. He looked at Ellie. You are not going anywhere. Is that clear? She held his eyes. Clear, she said. By 8 o'clock that evening, the kitchen table had 8 people around it, and the fire in the stove was built high, and the lamp was burning bright, and Ellie stood at the end of the table with her papers laid out in front of her, and the controlled steadiness of someone who has been preparing for this particular room for longer than she has been in Montana Territory. She explained it all one final time. Seal 1147, Franklin Aldridge's certification already en route to Washington, the filing that needed to be in the hands of the court clerk by midnight tonight for it to be on the record before the morning hearing. The strategy of the federal hold working in parallel with the territorial proceeding. Harlan Dodd said, what if they don't accept the filing tonight? The clerk is required by territorial statute to accept and timestamp any legal filing presented before midnight prior to a scheduled hearing. Ellie said, he has no discretionary authority to refuse it. If he refuses it, that refusal becomes its own documented irregularity, which adds evidence to the federal case. Minnie Calhoun, who had said nothing up to this point, looked at Ellie with the steady appraisal of a woman who had been running her own ranch since her husband died and had learned to read people the way other people read weather. You have been fighting this man for 2 years, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Ellie said, and you rode 3 days through the mountains to get the peace you needed. We did, Ellie said, glancing at Caleb. Minnie Calhoun nodded once slowly with the weight of genuine respect. Seth and Wade carried the filing to the court clerk's office at 9 o'clock, returning 40 minutes later with a stamped confirmation copy, and the room breathed in a way that it had not breathed all evening. The paperwork was done. The federal channel was open. The morning would determine what the territorial channel would yield. The neighbors left by 10. Jed Holloway shook Caleb's hand at the door and then looked at Ellie and said, "Thank you," quietly and with the absolute sincerity of a man who does not say that word loosely. When the house was quiet, when Seth and Wade had gone to their rooms, Ellie was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard in the cold dark. And Caleb came in from outside where he had been checking the horses, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You should sleep," he said. "It will be an early morning." "In a moment," she said. He came and stood near the table not far from where she stood, and the kitchen was quiet around them with only the sound of the fire and the wind finding the loose edge of something outside. "I need to say something before tomorrow," she said. "Not because I think something will go wrong, but because I have a habit of not saying things when there is still time to say them, and I have had enough of that habit." He waited. "When I answered Seth's letter, I told myself I was doing it because I had run out of options," she said. "I told myself I was being practical, that the wages of practicality were enough reason." She looked at the window at the reflection of the lamplight in the glass. "I think I have been practical long enough that I mistook it for who I was." "Ellie," she turned, "whatever needs to be said," he told her, "will still be true on the other side of tomorrow." She looked at him in the lamplight of his kitchen, the kitchen she had walked into through an unlatched window 6 weeks ago and started a fire in, and something in her face settled the particular easing of a person who has been holding something at arm's length and has finally decided to set it down. "All right," she said. The fire held. The lamp burned. Outside, the October dark held the Cascade Mountains in their old patience, and somewhere in the upper valley, the 4 apple trees stood in the cold along the North Creek bank, their roots in the Montana earth waiting the way things that are well planted wait for whatever season came next. Tomorrow was coming whether they were ready or not. They would be ready. The courthouse in Dry Creek had seen its share of hard mornings, but it had never been full before sunrise. Caleb was aware of that as he came through the main door at 10 minutes to 6, Ellie walking beside him, Wade and Seth behind. The room was already packed with people who had risen before first light and ridden in or walked in through the cold dark, because they understood collectively, and without needing to discuss it, that what was being decided here was not only the Holloway deed. The long benches were full of people who had built something in this valley with their hands and their years, and who had arrived at the same conclusion by the same road that if it could happen to Jed Holloway, it could happen to any of them. And the morning had therefore become everyone's morning. Jed Holloway and his wife sat in the front row. His wife had her hand through the crook of his arm, and her chin lifted, and her jaw set the posture of a woman who has prepared herself for any possible outcome and intends to meet it standing up. Jed's face was the face of a man who has spent 30 days carrying a weight he did not earn, and is now here at the end of the 30 days to learn whether the weight will be lifted or whether he will have to find a way to live with it permanently. Silas Pruitt sat behind them, hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the way nervous hands move when their owner is making them be still. Harlan Dodd stood at the far wall with his arms crossed, watching the door. Minnie Calhoun had taken a position at the aisle end of the third bench and was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving over the room with a calm, comprehensive attention, the look of someone who has decided to remember this day precisely as it happens. Emmett Briggs found Caleb's shoulder with one hand and squeezed it once without speaking, which was the kind of thing Emmett Briggs did instead of making a speech, and Caleb appreciated it in the way he appreciated all things that did exactly what they were meant to do and nothing more. Victor Crane came through the door at 6 o'clock exactly. He wore a coat that had been brushed and pressed, and he wore it well, the coat of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. His lawyer from Tucson came behind him with a briefcase of dark leather, and 2 other men who had the quiet professional manner of people paid to make their presence felt, without doing anything specific to justify their presence. Crane walked to the plaintiff's table and set his gloves down on the surface and looked around the room. with the measured survey of someone taking inventory, noting who was present and in what configuration, assessing the landscape the way a general assesses a field before he commits his forces to it. His eyes found Ellie. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked back at the front of the room and sat down, and his face had resumed its composed and patient surface. But something had changed in it in those 2 seconds. Some small recalibration. The expression of a man who has revised his estimate of the difficulty of the morning without letting the revision show in anything so obvious as an expression. The judge came out at 6:15, a heavy man in his 50s, with the careful, tired eyes of someone who has seen enough to distrust easy conclusions. He sat down at the bench, arranged his papers, and picked up the filing that had been stamped and logged the previous evening. He read it with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who knows that the quality of his reading will determine the quality of his ruling. Crane's lawyer rose before the judge had finished. Your Honor, the document just presented by the defense raises procedural concerns that require consideration before any evidentiary hearing can proceed. We would ask that the court allow us to examine the provenance of the submitted materials before they are admitted. The judge set the filing down and looked at the lawyer over the top of his reading glasses. Sit down, he said. The lawyer sat. The room was very quiet. The only sound for the next several minutes was the judge reading and the occasional soft percussion of pages turning and the low breath of a crowded room holding itself still. When the judge finished, he looked up. He looked at the documentation for a moment longer, as if confirming something. Then he looked at Crane. Mr. Crane, he said, the document before this court presents the following assertion. That notary seal number 1147, which appears on the debt instrument filed against the Holloway land title, was issued to a man named Asa Cornwell of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who died in 1868. That the seal was reported stolen or missing in 1869. That this same seal, identifiable by specific characteristics of its dye and wear pattern, as certified by a former federal land examiner, appears on documents associated with 11 additional land transactions across 4 territories over a period of 8 years. In each of those transactions, the acquiring party was either you directly or an entity you controlled. He paused. Would you like to address this court on how the same physical seal used to stamp documents in New Mexico Territory in 1869 came to authenticate a debt instrument in Montana Territory in 1873? Crane rose. His voice was smooth and his posture was untroubled, and he spoke with the practiced fluency of a man who has prepared for this question across many years and many rooms. Your Honor, I have been the victim of fraudulent documentation on multiple occasions. I act in good faith on instruments presented to me through established legal channels. If fraud has occurred in the sourcing of these documents, I am as much the injured party as anyone in this room. 11 times, the judge said, Your Honor, in 11 separate transactions across 4 territories spanning 8 years, the same fraudulent instrument was presented to you and you acted on it in good faith. The judge's voice had not raised itself even a fraction of a degree. It remained flat and precise, each word placed with the care of a man who intends his words to be quoted accurately. This court is not inclined to characterize 11 iterations of the same event as a pattern of victimhood. Crane's lawyer was on his feet again. Your Honor, the certification presented by the defense has not been subject to adversarial examination. The provenance of the comparison documents has not been established in this proceeding. We request a continuance of no less than 30 days to allow for proper review. The judge looked at him. The continuance you are requesting would expire 2 days after the Holloway deed deadline, the judge said. This court is aware of that arithmetic. Silence. Then Ellie stood up. She did not ask permission. She rose in the way of someone who has the right to stand, and the room felt it, the stillness that comes over a place when the person who speaks next is the person who has been carrying the weight of what everyone is about to hear. Your Honor, she said, my name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My father, Edward Whitmore, was a land attorney of 25 years standing whose practice was destroyed by a fraudulent debt instrument in 1872. That instrument bore notary seal number 1147. My father suffered a stroke in the aftermath of that proceeding and has been unable to work since. I have spent 2 years documenting the pattern of fraud connected to that seal, and I request that the findings of this court, including the certifications submitted by Franklin Aldridge, former federal land examiner, be formally transmitted to the Federal Land Commission in Washington as evidence in support of an ongoing inquiry into a systematic pattern of land fraud operating across multiple territories. She set a document on the table before her. This request has already been submitted in writing through the appropriate federal channel and is on record as of yesterday afternoon. The transmission to Washington is complete. She sat down. The room was absolutely still for a moment that stretched itself out beyond the dimensions of a normal moment. Crane had turned to look at her. For the first time since he had walked through the door, the careful composition of his face had developed a quality that was not calculation. It was something more fundamental, the expression of a man who has built a very large and sophisticated structure and is now watching one of its load-bearing walls receive information it was not designed to receive. The judge looked at Crane for a long time. Then he looked at his papers. Then he made his ruling. The property claims against Jed Holloway and all associated liens against the lands of Silas Pruitt, Minnie Calhoun, and Harlan Dodd were dismissed on the grounds that the authenticating documents had been produced through fraudulent instruments. The court's record of proceedings and all associated evidence would be transmitted to the Federal Land Commission in Washington in response to the formal request entered by Eleanor Whitmore. The circuit marshal was requested to make himself available for further instructions pending federal inquiry. The word federal landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it moving outward through every person present. Jed Holloway closed his eyes. His wife put her forehead against his shoulder for a moment and then straightened up and looked at the front of the room with the expression of a woman releasing 2 months of held breath. Crane remained standing at his table. He was still composing his response to what had happened, still working through the architecture of the next move, and for the first time in whatever number of years he had been operating this particular enterprise, the next move was not available. The federal channel was open and already in motion. The territorial record was sealed against him. The document trail led to a dead notary's stolen seal that had been certified by a man with 5 years of accumulated evidence and a former career that gave that certification legal weight. He picked up his gloves from the table. He put them on with the same care he had taken putting them down. He walked out of the courthouse and the room let him go because the man who watches a tide go out does not need to do anything to make that happen. He was out of Dry Creek before noon. No dramatic departure, no confrontation at the town line, no final words. Just 3 riders on good horses moving south on the main road under the pale October sky, with the circuit marshal standing at the door of his office, watching them go and making notes about what he was watching and when. Crane had not been destroyed. A man like that, with the resources he had accumulated across 11 successful operations, did not end in a single courtroom morning. But he had been stopped, and his name was now in a federal record, and the thing he had built his operation on the assumption that he could move through a territory and leave no trail that any single jurisdiction would be able to follow had been dismantled by a woman with 2 years of letters in a saddlebag and the systematic patience of someone who had learned to treat information as the only currency that did not depreciate. Emmett Briggs shook Caleb's hand outside the courthouse with the grip of a man who means it. Seth was grinning with an uncomplicated radiance that Caleb found in that particular moment entirely appropriate. Wade walked up to Ellie and said nothing for a moment, and then said quietly and without preamble, "Well done." That was all. But from Wade Hargrove, it was the equivalent of a speech, and she received it accordingly. That afternoon, the ranch felt different in the way a room feels different. After a window has been open, the air moving again after a long stillness, things finding their proper temperature. Caleb found Ellie at the North Creek after the others had come inside. She was standing in front of the 4 apple trees that Margaret had planted 6 years before her hands at her sides. Her face turned slightly upward toward the high mountain light. The trees were bare of their leaves now, the October cold having stripped them down to their essential shapes, but they stood in the way that well-rooted things stand without apology for their plainness, their investment of living happening underground where no one could see it. He came and stood beside her. "She would have understood what you did today," he said. Ellie did not answer immediately in the way of someone who is receiving a thing carefully. "She tried to do something very like it," Ellie said, "on her own, with what she had available." "Yes," he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I kept the notebook." She looked at him. "I put it back in the crate where she left it, up in the storeroom. I thought it should stay in the house." He looked at the 4 trees. "She would have gotten there eventually. She just ran out of time." Ellie did not answer that. There was nothing to answer. Some things are simply true and have to be lived with rather than resolved. He looked at the trees for a while longer. "I need to say something to you," he said, "directly, because I have been working up to it in the indirect way for long enough that I am becoming aware of how long it has been." She turned to look at him. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because Seth placed an advertisement and you answered it, not because you have nowhere else to go, or because you are useful to the running of this ranch, though both of those things are true. I want you to stay because this land has been asleep for 2 years and it is awake again, and I understand that the reason it is awake has less to do with the fence line being repaired than with who was there when it was repaired." He stopped. "I want to build this forward, with you, if that is something you are willing to consider." The light was moving down the mountain, the long gold of late afternoon, reaching across the meadow and touching the bare branches of the apple trees. "I have been telling myself practical stories about why I came here," she said, "about running out of road and making rational decisions. I told myself those stories because I had gotten very good at not wanting things I was likely to lose." She looked at him with the blue eyes that had not flinched from anything he had seen her face in the 6 weeks since she had turned away from his stove and told him dinner was almost ready. "I want to stay, Caleb, not as the practical outcome of a practical arrangement. I want to stay because of you." He put his hand over hers where it rested on the top rail of the fence beside the trees. "The same gesture as the bridge, and not the same gesture at all." "Then stay," he said. 3 weeks later, a traveling minister came through Dry Creek on his way north to Helena, and the wedding was held in the kitchen of the Hargrove Ranch on a Thursday evening, with 5 people present: Jed Holloway and his wife, Emmett Briggs, and the 2 brothers who had been there since the beginning. The minister stood before the fire, and the words he spoke were the words that had been spoken over 10,000 frontier unions in 100 years of Western country, plain and durable and adequate to the occasion. Caleb's vow was not from any book. He looked at Ellie and said, "I was a man who had decided the best he could do was endure. You walked into my house and reminded me that there is a difference between surviving and living. I will spend however long I have left being worthy of the courage it took you to make that walk." Ellie's vow was equally plain. "I came here with a list of broken things," she said. "I did not know that the most important one was something neither of us could see from the outside. I promise to stay here in this house, on this land, and to keep finding the things worth fixing for as long as we have." Seth for once said nothing. He wiped his eye with the back of his hand and looked at the ceiling, and then at the floor, and then out the window. Wade stood at Caleb's right side through the entire ceremony. When it was over and the minister had closed his book and the others were moving toward the table where Ellie had prepared a modest celebration, Wade touched his brother's arm. Caleb turned. Wade pulled him into an embrace that lasted 4 seconds and contained everything that 2 years of grief and 3 years before that of shared work and shared loss had accumulated between them, all the things neither of them had found a way to say with words. When they separated, Wade looked at Ellie and nodded once the nod of a man who has made a final and complete decision about where his loyalty lies. Spring came to the Cascade Valley the following March with a particular generosity The kind of spring that arrives after a hard winter and seems to understand that it owes something to the people who endured. The snow came off the high meadows in sheets of bright meltwater, and the creek ran high and clear, and the pasture grass came up thick and green in the lower fields where the drainage was good. Caleb and Ellie planted 10 apple trees on the north bank beside the 4 that Margaret had put in the ground 6 years before, spacing them with the same care, orienting them toward the best of the morning light, giving each one room to grow into its full shape without crowding the next. Wade appeared with a bucket of water partway through the afternoon without comment and began watering the trees they had already planted while they moved ahead to prepare the next holes. Seth sat on the fence rail and offered opinions about spacing until both Caleb and Ellie told him, with identical timing, to be quiet and do something useful, and the look on Seth's face at the identical timing was the best thing that had happened on the ranch in some considerable while. Edward Carver wrote from Washington in April. The Federal Land Commission had opened a formal inquiry. Aldridge's certification had been received and accepted. The case file was now designated as a multi-territorial fraud investigation, which meant it had the weight of a federal mandate rather than a regional complaint. Victor Crane's name was in a federal record that would follow him across every jurisdiction in the country. It did not undo what had been done. Edward Whitmore's practice was gone, and the years it had taken to build it were not coming back, and no document produced in Washington could restore the particular life he had made in Philadelphia before Crane walked through his office door. But it meant that what had been done to him was now officially federally provably wrong, and that it would not be done to anyone else in the same way by the same man. Edward Whitmore himself came to the Cascade Valley in July. Ellie saw him from the gate walking slowly from the wagon that had brought him from the Fort Benton stage station, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man relearning the full use of his body after 2 years of partial exile from it. He was thinner than she remembered, and his left hand still had the slight tremor that the stroke had left behind. But his back was straight, and his eyes, when they found her running toward him across the yard, were the same eyes she had grown up seeing across every table and every house they had shared, clear and present and unmistakably themselves. She did not say anything when she reached him. She put her arms around him, and he held her. In the yard of the Hargrove Ranch, held the silence of that reunion, with the particular respect that places develop when they have seen enough of human things to know when not to interrupt one. Caleb came across the yard at a walk and introduced himself with his name in his hand, and Edward Whitmore shook that hand with a grip that was still strong and held it for a moment longer than a standard greeting, and looked at his son-in-law with the eyes of a man making a specific kind of assessment. "She told me what happened here," Edward said. His speech was clear, as though slower than it once had been, each word given its full weight. "She told me about the courthouse." "She did the work," Caleb said. "She always did the work," Edward said. "I taught her that. I just could not protect her long enough for it to matter." He held Caleb's gaze steadily. "You protected her when she could not protect herself. That is a different skill, and I am grateful for it." They sat on the porch that evening after dinner while the others were inside, and they talked in the way of two men who do not need to establish common ground because it has already been established by a woman they both love, and the mountains turned from gold to gray to dark above the valley as the conversation moved at its own unhurried pace. "She planted trees," Caleb said at one point, gesturing toward the line of new apple trees along the North Creek, just visible in the last of the light. "She always did that," Edward said. "Even as a girl, planted things. Said it was the only honest argument that anything was going to continue." 3 months later, when summer had finished its work and the first signs of autumn were beginning to appear in the high meadow grass, a letter arrived from the Federal Land Commission, confirming that Victor Crane had been indicted on charges of systematic land fraud across 5 territories. Franklin Aldridge's certification had been central to the case. The specific seal number 1147 had been tracked through 13 transactions, and its use in each of them had been attributed directly to Crane's operation. The case would take time, federal cases always did, but the structure of the thing Crane had built was now fully visible to the people whose job it was to dismantle it, and the man himself was no longer moving freely through the Western territories, leaving sealed documents and impossible deadlines in his wake. Ellie read the letter at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and held it in both hands and sat with it for a while. "It will not give your father his practice back," Caleb said. "No," she said, "but it gives him his name back. That is what he asked for at the end, when he could still say things clearly. He said, just let the name be clean." The name would be clean. It was a federal record now. She set the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the trees along the North Creek. 14 of them, now the 4 old ones with their established branches and the 10 younger ones with their slender trunks, still finding their full strength. "He would want to know," she said. "Then write to him," Caleb said. She did. Edward Whitmore's health held through the following years, and in the autumn of 1882, when the distance from Philadelphia had become more burden than he could carry alone, Ellie and Caleb brought him north to the Cascade Valley for good. He lived in the east bedroom that looked out toward the Cascade Peaks for the better part of 2 years, and then declined quietly in the autumn of 1883 with the particular efficiency of a body that has finished what it came to do. He died on a February morning in 1884, with Ellie beside him and the winter light coming in clean through the east window. And Caleb built his coffin from Montana oak, and they buried him in the upper meadow, where the view stretched north to the high peaks and south to the valley floor, and the creek ran below with its patient sound. Ellie stood at the grave and said what needed to be said in a voice that held, and Caleb stood at her left side where a husband stands and the mountains stood behind them, the way they had always stood, without judgment and without comfort, simply present, which was enough. The years that followed had the texture of things that are built with care over time. Not dramatic years, not the years of courthouses and midnight filings and hard rides through mountain passes. Useful year seasons that accumulated into something with weight and solidity, the kind of life that does not look like much from any single point of standing in it, but reveals its shape only from the long view. Seth married a woman named Nora in the spring of 1875, a practical and quietly funny woman whose father ran the grain supply operation in Fort Benton, and she came to the ranch and added her particular quality to the household in the same way that good soil improves when a new element is introduced, not changing what was there but making it more itself. She and Ellie developed between them the kind of friendship that forms between two women who have both arrived somewhere by unconventional routes and understand each other's navigation. Wade took longer. He had always taken longer with everything that mattered, which was not a flaw but a function of the particular depth of his attention. He married Luella in the autumn of 1876, a widow of 2 years, whose steadiness matched his own, and whose willingness to speak plainly to him was the thing he had not known he needed until he encountered it. Wade became, over the years that followed, a more spoken man. Not a voluble man that was not in his nature, but a man who had learned to say the thing he meant while he still had the opportunity to say it, which was the lesson that the years between Margaret's death and Ellie's arrival had finally finished teaching him. Margaret Eleanor Hargrove was born in the spring of 1876. Caleb was in the barn when it happened because Seth had sent him there on a transparent excuse, and when Seth came to the barn door and said it was time, Caleb walked through the house and into the bedroom, and Ellie was sitting up with the child in her arms, and she looked at him with a quality in her face that he had not seen on her face before. Not the determined composure and not the careful steadiness, and not even the warmth he had come to know as simply hers. It was something more open than any of those things, something that the previous months had been building toward, and that had finally arrived along with the child. The child had blue eyes, which Caleb had somehow expected. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her and felt something happen in his chest that he did not try to name because he understood that some things work better without names. "Margaret Eleanor," Ellie said. "Yes," he said without hesitation. Wade came to the door of the bedroom later that evening and stood there looking at his brother holding the child and said nothing for a long time. Then he stepped back into the hallway and sat down against the wall and pressed the back of his hand briefly to his mouth. Seth, coming up the stairs, found him there and sat down beside him without asking why, and the two brothers sat in the hallway of the house where they had grown up and said nothing and said everything that needed to be said between them. In 1883, the federal court returned a verdict in the consolidated case against Victor Crane, 8 years in federal prison, restitution ordered in the amounts that could be determined. The 11 surviving victims of documented fraud were awarded formal legal remedy, which in most cases meant something real, and in some cases meant the kind of official acknowledgement that cannot be exchanged for anything practical, but is still worth having. Edward Whitmore's estate, managed by Ellie since his death, received the legal remedy that his case warranted. It was not a restoration of what had been taken. 20 years of a man's professional life do not have an assigned value that a court can compel to be repaid. But the debt was officially acknowledged as having never existed, and the documents that had created it were officially declared fraudulent and void, and the name Edward Whitmore was cleared in the records of every court that had previously ruled against him. Ellie read the final letter from the federal commissioner at the kitchen table on a September morning with the autumn light coming in through the south window and the sound of children playing somewhere in the yard outside. She read it twice. Then she got up and walked to the window and looked out at the 14 apple trees along the North Creek, the old 4 and the 10 new ones, and she stood there for a while. Caleb came in from outside and found her there. He looked at the letter on the table and then at her. "It's done," she said. He came to stand beside her, and they looked out at the trees together. "He would have wanted you to know that he knew," Caleb said. "Before he went, he knew you had done it." "He said so," she said. "That last morning, he held my hand and he said, 'You finished it, Ellie.' That was the last clear thing he said." She stayed at the window a moment longer. Then she turned away from it and went back to the kitchen and the day and the work of it, because that was what she had always done and that was who she was. And the valley outside the window continued in its ordinary motion, the creek running and the mountain standing, and the trees along the north bank putting their invisible effort into the deep work of roots. The years settled into their shape. 15 years passed, and then another 5, and the ranch grew into a different thing than it had been, not unrecognizable but fuller, the way a river gets fuller as more streams find their way into it. 200 head of cattle on the expanded south pasture. A second barn built to replace the one that had been fire damaged in October of 1873. This one built to last with proper foundation and roof pitch, and the south wall double insulated against the worst of the mountain winters. The garden that had appeared on Ellie's first list as simply overgrown had become over the years one of the most productive kitchen gardens in the valley, and the neighbors who had sat around the table on the night before the courthouse morning had come to know it as a landmark of the kind that does not appear on any official map. Margaret Eleanor Hargrove grew up knowing her name and what it meant. She grew up knowing the story of the apple trees and why there were 14 of them and not 4. She grew up hearing in the occasional way that parents tell children the things they need to understand about a morning in a courthouse, in a dead man's seal, and a woman who had spent 2 years building a case that a court finally had to hear. She learned the land the way her father had learned it, and then she left it the way young people leave things they love with the intention of returning. And she did return, and she brought with her a husband, and in time children of her own. One of those children was a girl born in 1892, with her great-grandmother's name as a middle name and hair the color of early autumn honey, and eyes that suggested the Whitmore blue would not be running out of the family anytime soon. Her parents called her Margot, and she was 6 years old in the October of 1898, and she had the particular quality of certain 6-year-olds of treating the world as a place that owed her information and intending to collect it. It was Margot who found the piece of brown wrapping paper. She had been in the kitchen looking for something to draw on, as she was always looking for something to draw on, working her way through the drawers of the old kitchen table with the systematic approach of someone on an official search. She found the paper in the back of the lowest drawer, folded twice, covered in small, neat writing that she could not fully read, but that had the particular quality of something that had been kept rather than forgotten. She brought it to her grandmother, who was at the far end of the kitchen with a lamp mending something. "Grandma Ellie," she said, "what is this?" Ellie took the paper and held it in the lamplight and looked at it, and her face did something that Margot would remember for the rest of her long life, though she would not have been able to say exactly what it was. A kind of traveling, a kind of return. She got up and took the paper outside to the porch where Caleb was sitting in the late afternoon light of an October evening that looked almost exactly like the October evening 25 years before, when a different afternoon light had fallen on this same porch, and none of what had since become their lives had yet been known to either of them. She put the paper in his hand. He looked at it. East fence line, 7 posts, replaced before first hard freeze. Coop wall, single board repair, north side, 2 feet of gap ground level, water trough, seal embrace before temperatures drop, south barn roof, 4 shingles missing 2 sections, garden plot entirely overgrown, not urgent but worth noting for spring. He read it to the end, then he read it again. By this time, Margot had followed her grandmother to the porch, and Margaret Eleanor had come out from inside with the youngest of her children on her hip, and Seth and Nora's son, who was visiting with his wife, had wandered over from the east side of the yard, and the porch of the Hargrove house had the quality it sometimes got in the evenings, when the family gathered without any particular plan and simply occupied the same space in the way of people who have been doing that long enough that it requires no arrangement. "Grandpa Caleb," Margot said, "what is that paper?" He looked at the paper in his hands. He looked at Ellie. She was watching him with the blue eyes that 25 years and all those seasons had made more themselves rather than less eyes that still held that quality. He had noticed the first evening she turned away from his stove, not fearless, but something more, considered the look of a person who has calculated the odds and chosen to proceed anyway. "Pull your chairs around," he said to the porches at large. "This is a story that takes a little while to tell." The children settled. Margaret Eleanor sat on the porch steps with the youngest on her lap. The adults found their places in the particular comfortable disorder of an extended family that knows each other's habits and accommodates them without discussion. Ellie sat beside Caleb in the chair she always occupied, close enough that their shoulders touched, which was how they had been sitting on this porch through uncountable evenings since the evening they were married in this kitchen by a traveling minister on a cold Thursday in November. Caleb turned the paper over in his hands once more. The handwriting was still legible. 25 years had not done much to it. "25 years ago, this October," he said, "I came home from 3 weeks up on the high pasture and saw smoke coming from my own chimney. A fire I hadn't built." He paused. "I hadn't built a fire in that house in 2 years. "Why not?" Margot asked. "Because I had stopped believing the land was worth what it asked of me," he said. "I was going through the motions of a rancher without remembering why a man builds something in the first place. And sometimes it takes someone coming through your door uninvited to remind you." "Was it Grandma Ellie who came through the door?" "It was your grandmother, Ellie," he said, "with a list of everything that needed fixing." "And did you fix it all?" He looked at the paper in his hands. He looked at the valley below them, the fence line straight along the east boundary, the new barn standing solid against the mountain slope, the garden plot that had not been overgrown for 25 years, the creek running along the north edge of the property past 14 trees that had been planted with intention and had made good on it. He looked at Ellie. "Most of it," he said. Ellie turned from the trees and looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved in the way it had always moved, quietly and without announcement, the particular expression that had been his for 25 years, and that he had never been able to fully anticipate, despite having seen it more times than he could count. "All of it," she said. The October light came down the mountain in long, warm angles and lay itself across the porch and across the yard and across the line of apple trees along the North Creek, where the roots went deep in the Montana earth, and the branches held their bare October shapes against the sky, with the patience of things that have put in enough years to no longer need to prove anything to anyone. From the chimney of the Hargrove house, a thin white column of smoke rose into the clear air and climbed without hurry toward the high country, steady and unhurried, the way it had risen every evening for 25 years. The way it would rise again tomorrow and the day after, and for all the days that remained. Right where it was supposed to be.